Ambassador TCA Raghavan, what a pleasure and privilege it is to welcome you to this episode of Book Talk.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.
This is such a wonderful book, Circles of Freedom, Friendship, Love and Loyalty in the Indian National Struggle. I request you to hold up the book since I don't have a copy.
So I hope you can see it clearly.
Yes, we can. Well, congratulations once again. It's a beautifully written book, and it's a very substantial book, over 350 pages. It's got an index, and I believe it flows very well. You develop all the themes and all the different characters, and as you say at the end, you close the circle. So it was just, if I may, say a few things about my own, should I say, not just reading experience, but engagement with some of the leading figures in this book. It was very moving to me because years ago I had worked on Sarojini Naidu, and you have very kindly...
And I used that quite a lot, yes.
You very kindly cited some of that work. And I came across all these characters, you see, especially Syed Mahmood. You talk about him and that very interesting connection with Sarojini Naidu. But that whole period, 1913 in London, during the war, and you see, Gandhi also figures because he's on his way back to India in 1915 in January. And of course, that circle, Syed Hassan, and of course your protagonist, as it were, Asif Ali, a very interesting person, and his wife Aruna. Aruna Asif Ali Road is where JNU's East Gate is,
That's right.
So
yes.
It was a very moving experience for me to read this book. And the two characters here, of course, Asif Ali himself, the first Indian ambassador to the US, Syed Hussain, the first Indian ambassador to Egypt, and you yourself, an esteemed High Commissioner both to Pakistan and Singapore. So in many ways, this was, a circle of friendship of people past and people present as far as I was concerned. So once again, what a wonderful book. Congratulations. I highly recommend it to our readers. So let me start by asking you, how did you sort of come upon this theme? Because your last book was about the history men, which was another book I enjoyed. What made you take up some of these forgotten figures, if I may put it that way?
Well, I was asked by my publisher, Jagadot, about 3 years ago, or maybe 4 years ago, to think about a book on the national movement, because the 75th anniversary of our freedom was approaching, and they were keen to do a book on the national movement. And I thought about it, and I didn't want to write just another book, because it's a well-trodden path. And I studied history in Jawaharlal Nehru University, and I didn't really know what one can say which is that much new about the main currents in the national. But then I chanced upon Asif Ali's memoirs. And while going through it, I encountered these other characters, and I found that they were all together as younger versions in London at the same time. So I thought, let me see what happens to them. Aruna Asif Ali, of course, enters the book much later because she's a much younger person. But Sarojini Naidu, Asif Ali, Syed Hassan, Syed Mahmood, I thought, let me track their lives over the next 30, 35, 40 years and see what happens to their friendship, their association. So which is how the idea of the book first came to me. And I thought of not so much trying to unearth new evidence, but asking new questions, which is why I thought, let me look more at issues of friendship, love, and loyalty. That is the subtitle of the book. So really, while there is a great deal of politics and about the main issues and so on, but my central interest was to see the personal relationships at a time of great political ferment.
And of course, there are other very fascinating characters like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founding
Yes.
father of Pakistan, who was also in London around that time. And, Jawaharlal Nehru was in the Inns of Court, though he did not know Asif Ali. So it's a very, I would say, widening circle of friendship, influence. And another very important character in your book is, of course, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, or Veer
Yes.
Savarkar,
Yes.
who was at India House at that time. Shamji Krishna Varma. So, this is what brings me to my sort of follow up question, which is, the idea of circles of friendship as a historiographical method. And I think you're a historian yourself of great repute, and I think you use this model to some extent in the earlier book with the history men, because they all knew each other. So they were writing history, of course, and their values, their debates, their disagreements, the different camps that they belonged to represented the different schools of historiography, but in some ways they were also creators of history. In this case, of course, all of them were driven by this sense of destiny, as we see in your book. Sarojini Naidu, certainly at the age of 12 and 13, she knew that she was a child of destiny. Her motto was Excelsior ad astra, and of course, Asif Ali and all of these people had some sense of their own importance in the scheme of things to come. But I was going to get your opinion, if possible, on circles of friendship as a historiographical method.
Well, you see, what it does is when you look at a personal, uh, a set of personal relationships, let me put it like that, you end up animating the history you're writing. And that really was my intention, because I was not writing, and I don't write for a scholarly uh, audience. I leave that to real scholars like you. I write for more general audiences, and I find that unless you animate uh, the past, people won't really relate to it, and which is why looking at a set of relationships and how those relationships evolve, rather than looking at the lifeless structures and processes, which are important and those underwrite the relationships, of course. But my focus was to see how relationships get established and how they influence each of these characters.
Exactly, but I also noticed how you woven all the major currents of the time, both national and international, which is, I think, one of the, I would say, masterly traits of this book. But just to press you a little more on that question, normally we see, histories which are chronological, very detailed, and they talk about the larger, movements of that period. Or at the other end, there are almost biographies, histories of individuals, you see, and great individuals, like Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, who have been written up so often, and now more and more others are populating the story of our national struggle, Subhash Chandra Bose, or Savarkar, who has been a favorite for the last few years. So there are these narratives that focus on one key individual. But I think one of the great things about your book is that this idea of circles of friendship, if I may say so, gives us, as you said, a focus on relationships. And, one could extend it by writing histories even of places, like, say, if suppose we wrote a history of just Anand Bhavan, or the
Yes.
Golden Threshold, or the Sarabhai home in Ahmedabad. They would cast light, they would tell a very interesting facet of the larger story of the Indian freedom struggle, don't you think?
I think so. And I think, as I said, they animate the structure. And otherwise, the past becomes a very lifeless, dead kind of thing. But if you bring in real flesh and blood characters, I think it does help in making it more accessible. And my idea was to try to be as accessible as possible. I also was interested because I know you mentioned all the big names, Nehru, Savarkar, Gandhi. I also was interested in looking at people who were not in the big league. I mean, it's
Exactly.
not
So
as if
this,
any. It's
exactly. That's what I was saying. See, first of all, rather than focusing on one very important individual, you look at, as you said, these circles, because history also happens like that, not just the main character, but all these other clusters of characters. And then, as you rightly just said, and which I invite you to elaborate on, if you look at the so called minor characters, you get a very fascinating perspective, not only on the major characters with whom we seem to be obsessed, but also on the overall movement of history.
I think so, because I think if you look at the main events from a slightly tangential or peripheral perspective, you do understand what is happening much better. So I like working through tangential perspectives. So my first book was about two nobles, two Mughal nobles, attendant law. And while when we talk about the Mughals, we generally look at the emperors or those close to the or those part of the royal uh, household. I wanted to look at it from someone. They're not nobodies; they're important people, but they're not in the top table. They're not in the really big league. So Asaf Ali, Sayyid Hussain, Sayyid Mahmood, they are very much in the same league. I think Sarojini Naidu is on the threshold of the big league. But I think as you have this wonderful sentence in one of your I think your first book about her, that she was a major figure playing a minor role. Uh, so she too was also in some sense contributes to that peripheral uh, vision. And I found that gives you a good perspective on trying to see or ask contrarian questions about the national movement as a whole, and each of these characters was quite useful in that context.
Exactly. In fact, reading your book makes one realize how complex the national movement was. How many characters and strands, and should I say, how many complex interplays were going on throughout this period. And if you, as it were, focus the light on any one of these, then it's like a skein, which like a maybe like a interconnected set of roots, that you get a sense of how the totality of the movement also was just by looking at all these, as you said, these side figures. So let me just ask you this: of all these characters, which one did you find most interesting, most compelling, if I may put it that way?
Well, I focused most on Asif Ali because he seemed to you know bring together uh, all the features and all the contradictions of that process roughly between 1910 and 1950. First of all, he's a nationalist Muslim. That, and by the early 1930s, that's quite uh, a radical position because of the growing popularity of the Muslim League and the emergence of Muslim separatism, the appeal of Jinnah. So that he took a position which was not part of that mainstream makes him significant. But then he's very much a minority figure in the Congress leadership. And he's always, I think, he could not help but be conscious that his critics would see him as window dressing or Muslim appeasement for the Congress to show that it was representative of all Indians and not just a party representing Hindus. And finally, he's a Hindu married to a Muslim, which again brings in a. Oh, he's a Muslim married to a Hindu. I'm sorry, a Muslim married to a Hindu, which brings out, raises a whole set of other issues and questions. So for all these reasons, I decided to make him let Asif Ali provide the narrative spine. Uh, uh, and the fact that he had left a reasonably detailed memoir, which is, the original of which is not available, but it's still available. That made it possible. And then the other characters allowed me to add more meat and flesh to his story.
Exactly, but all the others are also so interesting. Syed Mahmood, for example, he's the one that I guess Acharya Kriplani accused Nehru of using for Muslim appeasement because
That's right.
he had, as it were, what should I say, capitulated and to the British and asked to be
Yeah.
released.
You see, well, Sayyid Mahmood is, one is what he stands for politically. And certainly, uh, he's a very, very persuasive and persistent voice in the Congress leadership, saying that you have to pay more regard to Muslim sentiment, and you can't just expect Muslims to just take what you're offering. You have to be more conscious and more focused on what they want. But as a person, his personality also is interesting because he's someone who is easily influenced by more dominant characters. And earlier in his life, it is Sarojini Naidu, and by the late 1920s, it's Jawaharlal Nehru. So he's very much of he's a, in many ways, he's a less assertive personality. And he's always willing to accommodate and bend uh, to the stronger personalities around him. But at the same time, he remains a persistent voice, often to the great irritation of others in the Congress, because he's talking about what they see are parochial but issues, but he doesn't see it as that. He sees it as central to the national movement.
And then there's Syed Hussain, who in some ways is the least realized of all the three that we've talked about so far.
Well, yeah, and Sayyid Hussain, again, great friends with Asif Ali as students in London, becomes part of Sarojini Naidu's uh, the circle, the court around her. But clearly, he had the most substantive relationship with Sarojini Naidu, and her letters to him are quite a revelation in many ways. Because when you think about, she's a woman in her early 30s, a mother of four, and she has this great friendship with this young man who's 10 years younger than her. And you're really wondering, is this platonic or is there more to it? And there are no answers to that, of course. But she is clearly a figure she depends on much more.
Absolutely. She can confide in him and also receive very useful critical advice. She sends him poems as manuscripts. And in a way, it's the reversal of the relationship that she had with Sayyid Mahmood, which for me was one of the big discoveries when I was doing her edited
right.
letters,
Yes,
because he
yes.
was so much in love with her, and how she weaned him away from that to the bigger passion of the national movement. I'll talk about the love angle in a moment, but coming back to Syed Hussain, would you say that, he kind of flits in and out of the narrative, not just because he spent lots of years out of India in the middle, the very crucial years he was out, but also because he was even more on the fringes of the mainstream?
I think circumstances forced him into that role. And he was otherwise someone with a great deal of potential. Because after all, he was hired by the Bombay Chronicle when it was the most important platform that the national movement had as an assistant editor. And he was a rising star. But then he met and eloped with Motilal Nehru's daughter. And thereby, it led to a situation where Mahatma Gandhi and Motilal Nehru more or less decided that this relation, this has to be put an end to. And he was shunted off to the US, where he lived for the next 30 years. So circumstances, in a sense, marginalized because his friends are moving in higher and higher orbits, making difficult choices, going to jail, and each of them is really confronted with the central issues of the time, while he is leading an emigre existence. He's giving lectures and writing articles, but he's far removed from the real action. So his life has an unfulfilled, uh, sense to it, right to the end.
So true, so true. In fact, that the love side I wanted to leave for a little later, but now that you've brought it up, I mean, after all, Swarup Rani is better known as Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in her new avatar. She married Ranjit Pandit, who was also a great scholar. He translated the Raj Tarangini, and he died in a British jail, you know. So it was a whole set of unfulfilled relationships, in a manner of speaking, though, you know, Nayantara Sehgal fondly remembers happy days, you see, when they were growing up together. But so that was a marriage or relationship, whether it was a full-fledged marriage or an elopement is not yet clear, but which was frowned upon by Motilal Gandhiji. And yet when it came to Indira Gandhi, who also married outside the community, she married Firoz Gandhi, who was a Parsi. By that time, things had changed and she was permitted. And then when we come to Aruna Asaf Ali, 20 years or more younger, with a surname like Ganguly, a Brahmin Bengali surname, Gandhiji, in fact, says, oh, you're a symbol of Hindu-Muslim unity.
Well, I did think about that. Why did Gandhiji accept the Aruna Ganguly Asaf Ali marriage? And my guess is that he realized he would not be able to do anything about it. Unlike in the case of Motilal Nehru, Motilal Nehru's daughter, or Sarup Nehru, or in the case of his own son, and he put an end to a possible matrimonial alliance between his son and a Muslim girl from South Africa. I think in the case of Asaf Ali and Aruna Asaf Ali, he probably had the sense that he won't be able to do anything about it. And possibly they were, one or two steps removed from him. He knew them, but he didn't know them very well. I think those factors led him to accepting the relationship. But it's an extraordinary, Aruna Ganguly was came from a very well-known family. They were related to Rabindranath Tagore. Her father's brother was a member of the Royal Commission on Agriculture. So it was not as if Asif Ali was a relative, nobody marrying much above him. Plus, there was a 20-year age difference. He was 41 or 42 and she was just 19. Plus, it was a Hindu-Muslim relationship. And this happening in 1927 or 1928 is quite extraordinary.
Oh, absolutely. You write in your book how the different sections of the public and the media reacted. So this whole idea of love jihad is not at all new. They were accused, and in fact, Asaf Ali was in a way accused of love jihad by, these right-wing Hindu periodicals right then, though they didn't use quite that word. But it's also interesting how you note in your book that in the civil ceremony, they agreed that neither would convert. And yet there was a bit of a confusion in my mind because you also say that she took on a Muslim name, Kulsum.
You see, their first marriage was an Islamic wedding. And she did technically convert, in the sense she took on a Muslim name, but I don't think she ever did anything more than that. And Asaf Ali, to his great credit, never expected her or wanted her to do anything more than that. It was just a kind of a routine step for the marriage to be officially, acceptable. Thereafter, they had a formal civil marriage, which did not require conversion.
No, the reason I bring this up is because when Sarojini Naidu married Govindarajalu Naidu, they married under the Special Marriages Act, which, because that was an intercaste marriage and also caused a huge sensation when that happened. I think it was talked about everywhere. And I remember that reading about how Pandit Veerasilingam took a lead in solemnizing. He was an Arya Samaji in solemnizing the marriage. So the point is, they did have an option to go out of the Nikah Nama plus civil ceremony. They could have done the Special Marriages Act, but they didn't. I mean, this is a relatively minor note, but I do want to come to the Hindu-Muslim angle in a moment, because I think that's really the crux of your book in many different ways. But coming back to the topic of love, would you say that the national movement had so much, should I say, energy? It was so demanding. It was a jealous mistress, if you want to use that phrase, that it destroyed so many relationships. I mean, if you look at the people who were there at that time, hardly anybody had a successful and happy and long married life. Look at the Nehrus, Kamala feeling always inferior, dying young in a sanatorium. And Sarojini Naidu herself, it started as a happy love marriage, and then they drifted more and more apart till, at her swearing in, when she was the governor, or as she facetiously said, governess of India's largest state, Govindarajalu Naidu was not there. And again, you see this drift. You document it with the Asif Alis. I mean, when she went underground and became a kind of revolutionary, that was the last bit, because he says, I created her. And the Pygmalion, I mean, now she was too big for him. And Syed Hussain, you've already mentioned, one breakup with Swarup Rani, and then him and Sarojini Naidu, we don't know exactly what that was. Rati Jinnah and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, again a marriage gone wrong. To some extent, Kasturba and Gandhi, difficult marriage. I wouldn't say that it had failed. But on and on you can go. Savarkar, very sad. I mean, always separated from his wife. So all the characters that we come across, as it were, in this book, the love part of it is somehow unfulfilled. Would you say that?
Well, that's true. I didn't realize Dr. Naidu had not attended the swearing in. And it tells Sarojini Naidu's swearing. It tells you something about that relationship.
It was more than that, Ambassador, if I might just intervene, because her third book was called The Broken Wing. And in my correspondence, I show, I mean, Gokhale asks her why, is a golden, why does the singing bird have a broken wing? And then she talks about, her personal life, her illness, and later on, I've, in my selected poems and prose of Sarojini Naidu, I've unearthed some of her poems where she's, I believe, trying to win back Govindarajalu. But I think, they led separate lives. She held a salon in Mumbai. She was in the Taj suite. And more and more, I think there were also burnt letters that I came across, you see. And then Hansa Mehta, before she passed away, she started talking about it, and then suddenly she stopped. She said, let that be. Why go into it, So I feel that now Syed Mahmood also, he was very unhappy in his personal life. He and his wife were like not really comrades. They didn't have a romantic relationship, and that's one reason he was so attracted to Sarojini Naidu. Another relationship which didn't quite fructify. So what I'm asking is, does the freedom movement in some way blight the person?
I mean, it does place a great strain on individual relationships and on families. I think there's no doubt about it, because if you're away, if you don't have an ordered life, and you live from agitation to agitation and going to jail, I think it's an enormous burden on those who are close to you. But at the same time, I think to some extent, the national movement also germinated relationships. And you cannot think of Asif Ali and Aruna Asif Ali in a context outside that of the national movement. Because almost from the start, it defines the relationship. And certainly, yes, at the end of it, Aruna Asif Ali is quite different from the shy 19-year-old girl whom Asif Ali married. Uh, but but I think the national movement is also a crucible for these relationships, which, as time progresses, develop their own trajectories, and often because of the huge burden on them, can go wrong. And there are many other examples of the kind you mentioned. I think the Kriplanis provide another uh, example, and perhaps there are many others.
Well, Jai
Uh,
Prakash and his wife, who swore themselves to brahmacharya. You see,
that's right,
Pratibha, I think her name was Prabha, I think. No,
Prabha.
yeah, Prabhavati. But here's the paradox. I think reading your book, I felt that the romance or the love was in some ways stressed, if not blighted. But the friendships blossomed. In fact, one might look at the national movement as a history of friendships, enduring friendships. And some of them endured after the partition, though you point out how, when on an impulse almost, I think it was Syed Hussain who phones Jinnah, and Jinnah doesn't want to
That's right.
talk to him.
That's right. Well, you see, the relationships which interested me were of these three young men, Muslim young men, each of whom is totally infatuated for some period of time with Sarojini Naidu. And it tells you something about Sarojini Naidu, of course, but also that these young men had never met a woman like her before. There was nothing which prepared them to meet a woman who is so outgoing, so charming. Sure. Because in their own lives, women were much more cloistered. Uh, Not necessarily so, but principally so. And I think that is something which really interested me. And Sarojini Naidu herself, I think, makes a great effort with these young men, and tries to make sure that they are part of the mainstream, and which she is there, and don't wander off in any other direction. Her relationship with Sayyid Mahmood in the letters you edited, or in fact with Sayyid Hussain, and also with Asif Ali, bring that out very clearly.
Oh, for sure. I think especially with Sayyid Hussain, with Sayyid Mahmood, who could have gone in either direction. He was attracted to the Muslim League. He came from the landed aristocracy. So there was a class interest. She almost made it her personal mission to ensure that he remained in the Congress fold. And as you
Yeah.
rightly said, I think that Sarojini Naidu saw herself as a mentor for many younger Muslim men, even from Hyderabad, to help them sort of come from that feudal world, to the modern world, and to the modern, you might say, secular world rather than the communal world. Which brings me to the, I guess, not the elephant in the room, but one of the, I think, the greatest contributions of your book, which is that it is about Hindu-Muslim relations throughout the freedom struggle, through a crucial period. I think the question of Hindu-Muslim relations throughout the freedom struggle is really important. But if you see 1857 as a takeoff point, and even Savarkar, as you point out, was all for Hindu-Muslim unity till the Khilafat, right? So from 1857 to 1947, if we did a history of the Hindu-Muslim relationship in the subcontinent, I think your book will be one of the key sources to try and map it.
Well, the Hindu-Muslim question is something which you have to grapple with when you're looking at the freedom struggle, because that's the other half. That's the great failure. So while the national movement has a great success in terms of decolonization, it's the other half is the great failure, which is partition. So you have to look at the two together, and with there are numerous theories, and there are many ways of looking at it. But again, if one sees it in terms of personal trajectories, there's no uniform pattern. Uh, Muhammad Ali Jinnah begins as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. I mean, he is, for all practical purposes, secular to the core. Uh, it's extraordinary that the Jinnah of 1915 or 1916 is the Jinnah of 1937 or 1938. It's a truly extraordinary change. Similarly, Savarkar made his reputation, his All India reputation, because of his book on 1857. And he is very much a protagonist of Hindu-Muslim unity. His main heroes in the book are all Muslims. Now, the Savarkar of 1907 is indistinct, is such a contrast from the Savarkar of 1925 or 1926. You look at Tilak. Tilak is the man who brought Hinduism into politics. With the Shivaji festival, the Ganpati festival, that he is the protagonist of the Lucknow Pact, 1916, which guarantees reserved seats for Muslims in legislative bodies. So there's no uniform linear trajectory that you can plot. It's these zigzag patterns, and there are many other examples of this kind. Why do people change in this way? So partly it has to do with their own personal experiences, partly in terms of how they see the world around them. But clearly, between 1915 and 1925, something shifts in Indian politics, because all these changes happen in that decade. And my effort was not so much to conclusively settle the debate, but rather, because that debate can never be settled, but rather situate these individuals in that context.
Exactly. And I feel that you succeed in showing how important friendships are. And it is a sad, but I think true observation that the scope of friendships between Hindus and Muslims, even in contemporary India, seems to be declining. When we were
Yes.
growing up, we had very close friends who were Muslims. And now I feel that the divide is more deeply entrenched, it would seem.
I would say so. I would think so. And and it's much more than a social divide. It's also a divide in terms of you don't encounter that many Muslims in the workplace. They are not necessarily part of your close circle of friends. So yes, I think to that extent, in terms of uh, I think that the polarization has been very regressive.
Exactly. And yet, when we talk about Akhanda Bharat, one of the points I make in circles where such conversations happen, I always say you can't do this without close friendships. So that one of the lessons that we learned from the Congress is how much investment was made in getting to know one another, in sharing values. And I think your book shows that. So even if you may say that Congress was guilty of appeasement or tokenism, the actuality is that the amount of time, energy, and effort that major people put in to create this broad tent, this large tent, if you want to call it, where everyone felt welcomed and respected, was enormous. It's not to be undermined.
I think even in the right wing of the Congress, because occasionally I've quoted K.M. Munshi, for instance, and he's a good example of that. But there are others too. I think even in the right wing of the Congress, there is this consciousness that in the end, the value of your democracy depends on how you treat minorities. I think that understanding, I think that acceptance is there, and I think that is something which we have lost. That the understanding of what democracy really means, because terms like appeasement, and appeasement is an old term. It has a long history, but appeasement is too cynical perspective, because I think what what lay behind appeasement, or what we call appeasement or tokenism, was this consciousness that minorities are important to enhance the quality of your democracy.
Exactly, exactly. In fact, you were the High Commissioner, Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan. What was your experience over there when you served as India's representative?
Well, you cannot use the Indian experience to comment on Pakistan, because it's a totally different country. And I think the one big difference, of course, which is why, uh, which is something which we should never forget, that minorities have always been and are a political factor in India. And minorities don't exist as a political factor in Pakistan. So, while there may be minority issues in terms of human rights issues in Pakistan, there may be questions of discrimination or oppression, but it's quite qualitatively different from minorities as a political factor, the way they are, the way it is in India. So that's one fundamental difference between Pakistan and India. And the second is, of course, we have, markedly or radically opposed readings of history. And so in Pakistan, their perspective on the last 150 years of our history, perhaps even longer, is quite in contrast to the way most of us look at Indian history ourselves.
Exactly. Well, it made me think that when you said the consciousness of minorities, that is absent in Pakistan. The idea that for the polity and social fabric to be successful, one must have that consciousness. But,
That's
to
right.
come back to K. Munshi and the police action, it was a very different Hyderabad from the Hyderabad of Mahbub Ali Pasha, which was idealized and idealized in Sarojini Naidu's world. But the fact is, she couldn't do any of her nationalist politics in Hyderabad. It was forbidden. So I think that she had two sides to her personality. I've tried to point that out, that she always stepped outside of Hyderabad when she was a nationalist. And in Hyderabad, she was very much a part of the ruling elite, which was conformist. And when I looked at the last, the letters of the last days of the, independence movement, and just before, around 1947, 48, her husband is also writing to her about the tremendous corruption that, everyone knows the Nizam Shahi is coming to an end, the Razakars are rising, and everything is up for sale. So he's writing about that to Sarojini as well, So, as you said, the Hindu-Muslim question is really complex, but, the way you have mapped it, I find it very fascinating. And even with a character like Syed Hussain, who was, from Bengal, he belonged to the sort of Persianized Mushirabad aristocracy earlier on. So the Bengali Muslim, now we didn't talk much about Bangladesh. Pakistan is another kettle of fish. But Gandhi, till his final breath, he started with Hindu-Muslim unity, then he said Hindu-Muslim amity, and finally said, let's settle for Hindu-Muslim coexistence at least. And the terms of the covenant have still not been worked out. We're still a work in progress. So after reading your book, I wanted to ask you, what do you think about this so-called elephant in the room? How are we to go forward on this question?
Well, I don't think there's one single way, but one is the Hindu-Muslim question as a communal issue, and it's certainly there as a communal issue, because both communities increasingly saw each other in opposition to each other. So that raises one set of issues. How do you address the communal issue? And people came up with different answers. Someone we don't talk about that much is Chitranjan Das, for instance, who was a major figure in Bengal politics, but he drew lessons which were quite different from many others in Bengal about the last 20, 25 years of Hindu-Muslim relations in Bengal. Because in Bengal, the partition of 1905 defined the politics of Bengal for a long time, and Chittaranjan Das consciously tried to stay out of that. And he was much reviled in the Congress later, quite isolated to some extent, because he went further than any other politician in the Congress party of that time in trying to accommodate Muslim interests. So, one of the things which he suggested was he said that reservations for legislative posts is not sufficient. You need reservations for appointments in government, for reservation in services. In other words, what we had for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, we should have for Muslims. That this was something which he proposed in 1921. So when today, in the midst of elections, we have this debate about people accusing each other that you want to have reservation for Muslims. Actually, Chittaranjan Das suggested that in 1920 or 1921. And Chittaranjan Das's most important political disciple was Subhash Chandra Bose. And we can only guess at where Subhash Chandra Bose's own instincts would have led him. I suspect he would have been quite close to Chittaranjan.
Well, that looks like another book in the making, but certainly in the INA, in the Azad Hind Fauj, Subhash Chandra Bose made a very conscious attempt to give equal status to the Muslim members, and absolutely clear how he did it. He avoided any religious symbolism. Whatever we know about the history of the way he formed the Azad Hind Fauj or Indian National Army shows this. But this
was the communal issue. How do you address these entitlements? And it's quite a complex issue, because in North India, what Muslims expected was to a great extent also tied up to the fact that the upper class amongst them still had memories of being the ruling class. So it's not an easy thing to address. It's one set of very, very complex issues. The other set of equally complex issues are federal in nature. What do you do with provinces which are Muslim majority? Bengal, Punjab, Northwest frontier. So the federal issue and the communal Kashmir and the entitlement issue really came together. And the national, the leadership was not able to really unknot that knot. To my mind, because of the role which the British played. I think that was the central problem which became very, very clear by the end of the 1930s. The communal angle of it. How do you address entitlements? But then there's the federal issue, and then there's the role of the colonial state.
In fact, you've really hit the nail on the head there, because reading through this book, I also felt how disempowered and vulnerable Indians were, and how easily they could be manipulated by the colonial authorities. In fact, it's a lesson for us even today, those who have delusions of grandeur, that if you really look at that period carefully, you actually see that the major, so to speak, the decisive moves were actually made by others, and we just pretend that the agency that we had was so enormous, which is not true. Even the uncle who funded Asif Ali's studies abroad was a British agent. Everywhere there was surveillance. As Christopher Bailey says, it was, an empire of information and surveillance as much as it was an empire, of brute force. And how the Dhingras dropped the name Chamanlal, he dropped his last name, surname, because of that, so to speak, tainted association. And even the desperation of a Madanlal Dhingra in assassinating Curzon Wiley, shows how small the scope of action, for any fundamental change really was. It's as if the cards were still in the hands of the great powers. And that, in a way, by the way, just an aside on the reservation, for Muslims, it came up in the Constituent Assembly debates as well, over and over again. And it was Dr. Ambedkar who said no, that this is only and only for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, So the question never went away, and it's again back. OBC Muslim quotas, Pasmanda quota, non-quota, etc. As you rightly said, it's still very much current. I want to bring us to another little, not little, but an issue, a major issue, which is still current, which is the issue of Palestine. And as you show in your book, our first ambassador to the US, in a way, Asif Ali, he overplayed his hand by grandstanding. These are words you've used, trying to play to the Arab gallery, and even Nehru was a tad disappointed with him.
Well, he was accused of grandstanding, of being unable to resist the opportunity to grandstand. But I think intuitively he had a better understanding of what was happening than many others, because what was being recommended was a partition, and he knew that partition is not the answer. I think instinctively he may not have had the analytical wherewithal to articulate it with rigor, but I think instinctively he knew that partition is not the answer, and because he understood that partition is not the answer anymore. Because partition following a breakdown of relations is going to only lead to a situation which will progressively get worse, as we have seen in the case of India and Pakistan, or indeed as we've seen in the case of Israel and Palestine. So I think it continues. So I think this intuitive understanding that partition, which was, you see, I think he also understood instinctively that the British approach, and he was quite critical of the British, and Nehru didn't like it because he said, you're needlessly poking fingers at the British. It doesn't get you anything. But I think what Asif Ali understood was that for the British, partitioning and quitting was a well-established template by them. It had been developed in Ireland, was used in India, and they were going to apply it to Palestine also. I think he instinctively knew that this is the route to disaster. And I think there's something to be said for that, because if you see the end of empire, not just in India, but even otherwise, if you look at the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan or from Vietnam earlier, the end of empire, when it takes place, it really cracks all illusions of permanence. So whatever was this great empire of information which the British colonial state built up, and however effective and in command they may have appeared to have been, but when push came to shove, it turned out to be a very shaky enterprise because they lost control.
That's what happened in Singapore. In Singapore, they just vacated.
They lost control. And in India, they not only lost control and they lost confidence, but they made the situation even more tragic and more complex by prematurely withdrawing. Mountbatten, what was meant to be a withdrawal by June of 1948, or May of 1948, advanced it to August of 1947, which just made the administrative confusion impossible to remedy. So I think we cannot understand the breakdown in Hindu-Muslim relations, even while acknowledging the fact that there were fundamental tensions, there were different perspectives on entitlements. There was the question of the federal issue, but you cannot understand it without taking into account the role of the colonial state.
Exactly. And even today, with, let's say, this issue of Khalistan, the neo-colonial powers and how they are creating some of these narratives, even abroad, and as it were, fostering and fomenting them, is illustrated. Let me end by asking you about the other ambassador, the one in Cairo, Syed Mahmood. One in the US, the other in Cairo, and his own last days, dying in Cairo in a practically unvisited grave. And the other great contribution, as it were, from that part, Maulana Azad, whose father was Arab, who was in the Al-Azhar University, and all these different connections, of India, the Middle East, on the one hand, partition, and the colonial powers and the United States. Using Sayyid Mahmood and what happened to him, what are the lessons that we can learn as an ambassador yourself?
I think one central lesson is that caution which not just Sayyid Mahmood, but also Azad, Asif Ali, but most of all, and before any of them, Mukhtar Ahmad Ansari. His cautioning Motilal, Mahatma Gandhi, that don't embark on a civil disobedience agitation unless you're sure that you'll have Muslims on board. Now, I think that question remains with us. How do we carry minorities alongside in the mainstream? I think that is a central issue which the Indian polity faces, and which all of us have to confront, because in the end, the quality of a democracy is the only litmus test is how minorities fare in a democracy.
And the greatest, as it were, the greatest attempt at this was the Khilafat movement, which unfortunately completely went awry.
And it failed because perhaps the premises itself were faulty. But you cannot doubt the motivation behind it, that if an issue is important to the Muslims, I should try to give it importance. I think this was, so the motivation was, I think, high-minded and faultless, but the premises were faulty, that you were using an issue in the other part of the world and making it central to Indian politics.
In fact, don't you think, Ambassador, that at that moment, the Indian Muslims themselves were so grossly misled, in the sense that, all the leaders seemed to think it was an important issue, and whereas in Turkey, the winds of change were blowing so rapidly that when Kemal Ataturk sort of abolished the caliphate, the Indian Muslims were standing with mud in their face, as it were.
Well, I think, as I said, in North India, there was always this issue of the upper class Muslims could never get over the fact that they were the ruling class at one point in time. It's not easy to address that sentiment, because how can you address that? You cannot possibly say become the ruling class again. And K.M. Munshi, in one of his letters, put it very well, that while we all want Muslims to play a very important role, we cannot make a minority into a statutory majority.
Exactly. So that delusionism, the delusionism, I think, is what I was alluding to, because when Tipu Sultan writes to the Caliph to help him against the British, there's no reply. So the idea of the Ummah, the idea of international Islamism, somehow has greater purchase in the subcontinent. And as you rightly said in your book, none of the Mughal emperors swore by the Caliph. In fact, Akbar. Exactly. Akbar used to pay them off so that his people could go off on Hajj. So I think subcontinental Islam was in a time wrap, it would seem, and maybe still is to some extent.
With Tipu Sultan, you can argue that it was more tactical.
Even so, that pan-Islamism, the appeal of re-establishing the great empire, Shikwa-e-Jawab, and I think, was it Sayyid, is it Nomani or whoever? I mean, those,
Simply
Hali, I
nobody.
think. Hali, I mean, the regret over the loss of, supremacy, somehow that nostalgia, that elegiac regret over that was much more pronounced, it would seem, in the subcontinent, where there was also the aspiration with Maulana Maududi and others to create a pristine Islamic state, whereas closer to Europe, Kemal Ataturk already said that this is the wrong path. There's nothing left in that narrative. We'll have to recreate ourselves, in a modern manner and not.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, that was part of the Muslim predicament in India, the loss of power. And the fact, what is also true, that post 1857, uh, the by and large, it was the Muslims which were at the receiving end of the colonial state's oppressive policies. It was not so much the Hindus. I mean, the most directly targeted were the Muslims themselves, because they were seen as being responsible for the revolt. But I think, to some extent, those in the national movement, there was understanding of that Muslim arms, and an effort was made to accommodate it, but it didn't work. It ended in a failure. You're quite right about that. That failure is very evident, and I would say the role of the colonial state, while it's easy and convenient to blame a third party, nevertheless, from studying the history of the period, the role of the colonial state can never be underestimated.
Exactly, but then, as Gandhi would say, that shows us our own complicity or responsibility to the extent to which we handed over power to them right till the end. But just to end on this once again, do you think we should, as the government should, the MEA should reclaim Syed Hussain in some way? He's totally forgotten.
Well, there was a biography of him which appeared 2 or 3 years ago. And yes, he can be, but there are many other figures who could be reclaimed, and not just in your uh, modern history, even in your medieval history. I mean, if we, while you're reviving the Nalanda University, and it's a worthwhile, very good thing to do, there was an outstanding Islamic university in Gulbarga or in Bidar. I think we should certainly reclaim that space too, because India has such a large, huge population of Muslims. Not to leverage that in international affairs today is underutilizing an asset.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us today, Ambassador Raghavan. We wish you many more books. In fact, in your second innings, I think your writing has blossomed and flowered, if I may say so. And there are many books being written, but yours is one of the most readable that I've encountered in the last several months. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for inviting me. I greatly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.